Thank you for joining us. My name's Jason Lehman. I facilitate the Sheffield Equality Group, and I'll be chairing this event. A declaration of interest from myself that I co-founded UBI Lab Sheffield and have argued for a universal basic income. However, I think there are genuine and interesting questions the UBI movement has to answer with regard to inequality, and I'll be putting some of them tonight to our excellent panel on behalf of the Equality Trust. For those who aren't aware, the Equality Trust works to improve the quality of life in the UK by reducing socio-economic inequality. Inequality has a huge impact right across our society, an impact that causes personal suffering and struggle and ultimately harms the prospects of all of us. Many people are mobilising to change our society towards one that is more equal. Let me welcome our panel. Cleo Goodman is Director of Citizens Basic Income Network Scotland and co-founder of Compass's Basic Income Conversation. Kweku Amonoo-Quyst is an activist and speaker on UBI with Basic Income UK and a contributor to the Progressive Economics Forum proposal for a basic income. Dr Simon Duffy is co-founder of UBI Lab Network, growing network of local UBI campaigns across the UK and internationally. And Simon is also director of the Centre for Welfare Reform and chair of Citizens Network. Now, the pandemic has exposed a lot of existing social and economic problems. The Equality Trust is part of the Build Back Better campaign, looking at ways we can come out of this. Should a universal basic income be part of the solution? So to begin, I'd like to ask, how would a universal basic income actually reduce inequality? Perhaps mention how you'd fund a UBI, and as an additional thread to follow, what impact would a UBI have on people's practical day-to-day lives? Perhaps you could give an example. In any case, how would a universal basic income actually reduce inequality? And if I could ask Kweku to respond first on that. Thank you.
Hi, thanks everyone. Pleasure to be on the panel. I think to directly answer the question, by giving people more money, I think is the simple answer. And why that's essential is because we are currently dealing with two mechanisms in society that ought to do that, but aren't. The first is a broken labour market. And the second is a broken and very confusing welfare state. And so what UBI will do is to address the failure of both of those two mechanisms to provide a very simple thing, which is a guaranteed income for all citizens. And that's why it's so essential. It's going to be increasingly important in a society that we have now post-pandemic, where the overall economy is so unstable. And it's of particular importance because it's something that I hope we are able to discuss during the course of this conversation, which is the rise in personal debt, which is a serious concern for the overall economy. And also for people's general well-being, which is one of the key purposes of UBI, which I also hope we'll be discussing later.
Okay, if we could turn to Cleo.
Yeah, of course. I've somehow, despite being one of the most enthusiastic people about basic income in the world and spending most of my time talking about it, I've somehow become a bit more of a conservative basic income advocate recently. But my point here is essentially that a basic income is a concept, it's an idea, it has 5 characteristics, it's paid regularly to the individual in cash, universally and unconditionally, which means because it's an idea, because it's a tool, it can actually be designed to do loads and loads of different things. It can be designed in many different ways. And I would actually say that a basic income as an idea, as a concept, doesn't inherently address inequality, because you could pay for it in a way that exacerbates inequality. You could, as Kweku says, you could leave the labour market as it is, which causes a lot of inequality. So I think while I do believe a basic income can absolutely be used to address inequality and hopefully be one tool in a kind of tool belt of tools to eliminate it, I don't think it inherently does that. But the flip side of that is, if you build a basic income that is funded progressively, the funding mechanism reduces the gap between the highest earners and the lowest earners, the most wealthy, the least wealthy. If you make sure that it is comprehensive enough that it does provide this income floor for people to walk on, you know, this absolute cap that people can't fall below, that does go a long way to reduce the sharp end of inequality.
Thanks, Leo. And Simon, would you like to respond?
Yeah, I suppose if you approach it, I remember reading The Spirit Level and thinking about, I thought it was interesting that a lot of the emphasis in the equality movement and the Equality Trust was on distribution through the institution of businesses, how businesses distribute incomes, the salary ratios, and I think it's spot on that's really important, isn't it? The other thing that's really important to equality is just taxation. Actually taxing people with a lot of money or taxing people with high incomes is really important. But the third thing you have to do, which has got nothing to do with the labour market, is provide incomes to everybody, or at least to people without paid incomes or low paid incomes. And of the three logical mechanisms that you can use to manage income equality, surely the floor is the most important because it also deals with poverty. So it seems to me, just like logically, in terms of just the flow of money and who has it, if you don't address that issue, then even issues of like how fair a business distributes income are rather secondary. And because lots of people don't have work or will only have intermittent work, and that's always been the case, and it's particularly going to be the case in the future. And just thinking about these things through labour markets already buys into something that I think is a bit unacceptable, which is to assume that the only valuable activities are those that we measure through wages. As far as I'm aware, the most important human activities aren't employed activities at all. Things like being a mother or a father are far more important than working for Serco, for instance, where you can do no work at all and be happily paid by the government. So our whole economy is kind of based on a false premise, which is that the valuable things are in some way associated with the paid things. What we need to make sure is that everybody is economically secure and that the really valuable things get done. I think the other thing is the political aspect of basic income. So I think mathematically or logically, it seems to be really very important. But politically, what basic income does is says everybody matters and everybody has a stake in the system. I think what I would say, I mean, there's a whole poverty industry, people receiving lots of salaries to sit around and study poverty, and many of them don't like basic income as a solution. But for decades now, things have just got worse. What poverty has become is a little kind of side issue that specialists deal with. This isn't helping us as a society grapple with fundamental issues of inequality and poverty. What we need to do is give everybody a stake in this. That's why many of us say, you know, basic income is this generation's NHS. Until we all feel a stake in the sure foundation of the economy, in the basic income that we receive, we will never stick up for it and we will never look out for each other's interests. So it's really part of a kind of collective measure to make sure everybody is okay.
That's fine. I think we'll come back on a couple of those points soon. If I could just return to Cleo, you mentioned around progressive funding. What for you would be progressive funding for her?
I think, I'm not sure we're at the stage where we can talk really seriously about funding a basic income because it is a political question. Of course, you can design basic income models, and many greater minds than I have. You know, there are lots of exciting basic income models and various types of funding out there. But I think fundamentally the restrictions on that are going to be politics. Like we can't know exactly how we can put, you know, it's a very technical thing, and for me, so as you mentioned, I'm founding an organization called Basic Income Conversation, and our goal for the next couple of years is to speak to as many people around the UK about what kind of basic income they'd want to see and what they would value a basic income doing for them and for the people around them, but also how they would want it to be funded. So whether that would be with some sort of collective wealth fund, or, you know, a carbon tax, or something like a data tax, which, you know, personally, that's the way that I would lean. I think it should be also funded in a way that redistributes wealth and that uses, you know, that taxes higher earners more, so we can redistribute that. But I also think it should be using some sort of forward-looking concepts and innovations to make sure that this isn't just a policy that works right now. It's something that actually sets us up really well for the future.
Thanks. And Kweku, you mentioned around the benefits, the potential benefits to people's well-being. Do you want to kind of expand on that more, like the actual impact it potentially has for people?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the reasons why this is such an important issue to raise, and not one of these kind of very hippy-dippy issues, is because it has a real financial cost. We spent the best part before the COVID-19 pandemic kicked in properly in terms of the lockdown measures. We'd spent the best of 3 years talking about Brexit and the impact that was going to have on the British economy. Now, a no-deal Brexit will cost this country, according to the Office of Budget Responsibility, around £30 billion a year. The cost to this country, in terms of lost productivity from mental health issues that are not dealt with, is £45 billion. So that was why it was so important to reflect on the Finnish UBI trial, which showed that there was a massive improvement in the test group's well-being. It's not just because we should desire it for a society, for people to feel better. We should. It's because it has a serious economic impact, which is something that after the COVID-19 lockdown measures are eased, we really need. The economy is in very serious trouble. And so anything that improves people's well-being, anything that, as I'm sure we'll discuss later, stimulates demand in the economy, is something we should seriously be considering, if not already implementing. And that's why I think the time for basic income has arrived. It's not just myself who's saying that. That's Nicola Sturgeon, who I gather is regarded as the most competent politician in the country, which I'm afraid to say, given some of the other people who are leaders in this in the British Isles, is not a particularly high bar, but you know, we'll run with it. So what we're looking for is a policy that provides social security, because without social security we have social insecurity. We're looking for a policy that provides well-being, because we know that well-being has a serious economic impact at a time where we really do have to focus on stimulating the economy. And lastly, and most probably equally as importantly, we're looking for a policy that will stimulate demand in the economy. The only way the economy is going to turn again after almost 3 or 4 months of lockdown is we need people to spend money. And we can't get people to spend money if they don't have it. And you know, these things seem to be missing from the economic debate that we're having at the moment. You know, if the economy is going to improve, an economy that is largely driven by consumption, according to the IMF, we need people to have money in their pockets. And there's no other measure, not the labour market, not the welfare state, that is doing that consistently and effectively. So I think the basic income policy is one that meets all these challenges, and can be is able to immediately deal with the issues that I've raised.
Thanks. Yeah, it's interesting the point you make there around stimulating the economy, and the questions are coming in thick and fast, and it's really obvious that we're not going to get through all the questions, and my apologies for that. I think what we'll do is we'll let the questions perhaps steer the debate to a certain extent, and hopefully, you know, we can touch on many of them. There will not be time within the short time we have to cover all of them, but thank you very much for asking, and we'll obviously try and answer or discuss, kind of touch on as many areas as possible within the sort of bounds of this conversation. So actually, this was a set of questions that I was going to come to a little later, but as we've had a couple of questions, and your point, Kweku, about consumption, essentially, and stimulation of consumption. So I suppose a couple of questions around what values the UBI implies. So, we've touched on that a basic income by itself is not a solution to inequality. But perhaps if we could turn to the values that a basic income does imply, certainly some of the things that have come out of the discussions with the spirit level and the inner level is that, conspicuous consumption, often beyond our own personal means, is the route to economic growth and high status within our current socio-economic model. So doesn't a universal basic income just feed that? Individual freedom, private consumption is what a UBI is ultimately about. Wouldn't a basic income just keep on encouraging unsustainable consumption? Even more, personal debt wipes out a bit, but creates a bit more. And secondly, basic income at its heart is a sort of libertarian idea. It's a libertarian ideal that fails in itself to address inequality. It doesn't address the values that sustain inequality. It sort of pushes the idea of the autonomous individual free from social constraint or obligation. And if we talk about universal services, universal infrastructure, common goods, aren't those kinds of things, those kinds of goods, much more supportive of an equal society and the values that an equal society needs? So that kind of universal basic services, universal basic income argument there. So really 2 points. Doesn't a universal basic income actually encourage unsustainable consumption and that value of consumerism? And actually, wouldn't things like shared goods, common goods, be a better way of encouraging values of equality rather than a basic income? And if we turn to Cleo.
I'm just writing down the questions so I didn't forget. I've got about halfway through, so you see what I answer. I think you're both right and wrong with all of those statements. I think it's a nuanced debate, and the fact that a basic income isn't a reality just yet makes it still open-ended as to whether or not it will be something that inherently enables and encourages consumerism, or that is better or worse than shared, common ownership of spaces or whatever else you want to pit it against. But I don't know, I think the fundamental answer to this is a basic income is an income-related policy. So it solves or addresses income-related issues and nothing else directly. There might be other implications and other impacts, and I don't doubt that absolutely would be, that are very positive, potentially some negative, that occur because it's such a fundamentally, it would be such a big transition from where we're at just now. So I don't think it's the fact that we earn an income that encourages unsustainable consumerism. So therefore, I don't think that if we got a basic income, that would be the thing that was causing us to consume out with our means. I think unsustainable consumerism is a big social problem, and something that actually probably can't be addressed in a single policy or eliminated in a single policy. And I certainly don't think that a basic income is that policy that's going to eliminate unsustainable consumerism. What I do think it would do, though, it would give us all and the other part of it is it can't. A basic income wouldn't fund unsustainable consumerism because it only covers our basic needs. So I don't know, it would only put a little bit more money in most people's pockets, and depending on the model, as I saw Paul Spicker comment in the chat just there, that not all basic incomes would leave people with more money, but we would hope to design one that does. So yeah, the point here I think is we need to address that, and we need to have the space as individual human beings to understand the transition that we need to make in our personal life, but more importantly, the transitions that need to be made by the people in power to address things like climate change, any unsustainable practices that are occurring. And I think for me, the main benefit of a basic income would be that we would all be gifted more time and more bargaining power and more more resource and more headspace to address these things, both in our personal life and how we act ethically, how we act in a way that maintains our well-being, and also that allows us to do more activism, that allows us to spend more of our time doing things that we think and know matter and address these deep-seated issues, rather than doing things like working for companies that we don't necessarily align with just to make enough money to survive on.
Yeah. Simon, you wanna?
Yeah, I'm perhaps I'm too much of a zealot, but I don't understand how basic income isn't a solution to, at least a partial solution to, the question of equality. Because if we're talking about income equality, then where the floor is set is critical. And maybe we're not being clear enough about what basic income means. So basic income means people have enough money to live on, but that it's not subject to sanctions, conditionality. So you get it whether you do what the government thinks you should do or whether you just do what you think you should do. So that's a critical element of it. So the value it presumes is a value of equality and citizenship and the right to do what you choose to do. So it does have values associated with it. As I think human beings are naturally, they're caring, they take care of things. The consumerism isn't driven by the natural state of human beings. It's a feature of an economy that feeds insecurity and drives pointless GDP type behavior. So I don't think humans are the problem. I mean, government and power are the problems that drive those things, not human beings. So backing human beings and their basic equality seems to me a smart way of escaping some of those problems. Other logical features of basic income, by definition, are that it cuts away at kind of undue family dependency by giving everybody an income. Again, it's one of these things that's kind of forgotten in these discussions. Our benefit system basically says, if you've got somebody else in your family who's getting an income, then you've got to rely on them. And as we know, this is associated with increased domestic violence and financial abuse within the family. And in a perverse way, it's actually bad for families, because it means if people with independent incomes relying on a basic income or a benefit come together, they lose a significant amount of their income. So we've created a system that's actually bad for families and actually bad for household formation, and that's also bad for the economy, in fact, if that was the main concern. And the other thing that basic income does by design is it cuts away the extreme means testing on the poor. So what at the moment is, if you get benefits, then you effectively pay a tax rate on any earnings you do far in excess of the tax rates paid by the wealthy. That seems to me inherently unjust. It's, so not only do you lose out by being poor, but you lose out by being hit with even higher rates of tax as you start to earn any more money. All of this system is kind of crazily dysfunctional and really incoherent and really unfair. So if we care about equality, then basic income seems a logical thing to do. And it's associated, I don't know, the word libertarian's bandied around, Jason, but I mean, the earliest example I'm aware of something like basic income is the Athenian payments to citizens to participate in the democratic decision-making of Athens. That was a form of basic income, and it was premised on the most egalitarian democracy we've yet to see. Even though it was a democracy only of 25% of the population, that's far more democratic than modern Britain.
I'd love to digress into Athens, but perhaps not right now. Kweku.
Yeah, I think the key point is that we have to deal with the economy as it is, whilst trying to create circumstances that we'd like around it. When the welfare state was created, the most popular institution we have in this country is the National Health Service. But the National Health Service was developed in tandem as part of the Beveridge Report with a system of social security. So we had a service, the National Health Service. in step with social security payments. So there doesn't need to be a contradiction between the two. What we're looking at, in the 1940s when Beveridge wrote his report, and what we're looking at now, is a way of dealing with the ills that we have in our society. Some of those can be addressed through services. Some of those must be addressed through services and decommodification. But others have to be addressed with cash. It's really quite simple. If you are if you're in lockdown during the coronavirus pandemic, you still need to buy food, you still need to pay for your bills, you still need to pay for your internet, your mobile phone bill, and so on. And in terms of the ideological side of things, I'm sure there are a few good socialists watching the program. We should be aiming for the redistribution of everything. Whatever is on the table should be redistributed equitably. We need the redistribution of housing. We need the redistribution of our essential utilities so that they're commonly held. That was in the Labour manifesto in, last year. Sadly, we were defeated, but the principles remain. Every poll after poll after poll has shown that people want that redistribution in terms of common ownership of the major utilities. But most importantly of all, we need some redistribution of cash, because there's more than enough money circulating in the economy. And historical examples show us, particularly Norway, that this is the way to go. Only a few years ago, if you looked at the GDP of Norway, every GDP per head, almost every Norwegian would have been near enough a dollar millionaire. Now, we could have had the same had we done exactly what they did with Statoil. Had we nationalized our own oil services instead of privatizing the wealth and then giving it back to people in tax cuts, as Margaret Thatcher did. And then we could have concentrated on the other aspects that people are talking about. But in terms of the practical effects, we need a basic income to deal with the fact that we've got 1.6 million people at food banks. That needs to be sorted out with cash. We don't need people in a situation where they're supplicants. So I think the essential point is to deal with the economy as it is. There are certain things that are going to require cash, and not to see the two in terms of services. I know the basic services crowd seem to think in some cases, not all, that there's a mutual exclusion, but to recognise the fact there isn't. The two have to be in step, as they were when Beveridge wrote their report and as they are now.
Interesting responses, and it's interesting debate. There's plenty of questions coming in. Just to say that we can't really dip into the technical side of design of that whole kind of real nitty gritty, because those are endless conversations that keep on going, and perhaps the point maybe that it very much comes down to being a political point. I'd like to, there's been a couple of questions on this, so I'd like to ask really a question that if we agree that there's change that is needed, and again, I think Simon has touched on maybe a couple of responses to this, but perhaps if we could delve into it a little more. So say we have a sovereign wealth fund, or implement a carbon tax. A regressive policy would take that money and would give it to elites, would give it to the already rich. A balanced policy, like say basic income, would give it to everyone, arguably with some kind of progressive elements of redistribution in there. But arguably the most progressive policy would be to target support, to give money to those who need it most, whether in state support or money or infrastructure. So it isn't the most progressive thing, and this is kind of an argument that comes up quite often, isn't the most progressive thing if you're rebalancing taxation, if you're doing things, that you target the money at those who need it most. There's a second concern around that if you introduce a basic income, it's a very one-size-fits-all policy. So what you don't do is you don't reflect the fact that the current system is built up to support people who need most support. So, for example, people who are disabled, perhaps people who would lose out from changes in taxation, but are already, kind of struggling with high mortgage costs or something. So a one-size-fits-all system has problems, and it's also been mentioned, there are geographic differences as well. So not just household differences, but also differences, north to south, across Scotland, within London. So how does a one-size-all, system cope with the fact that each household is different, areas are different, the needs are different, and the fact that surely targeting money at those who need it most will be the best answer to inequality? And Simon, could I ask you to respond?
Yeah, I think there's a muddle of issues here. So personally, I don't think you can replace all benefits with one payment to individuals. That's why the Centre for Welfare Reform has always advocated what we call Basic Income Plus. And an example of why you need Basic Income Plus is you need to, if you have a disability, for instance, you face extra costs. So actually, one of the attractions of Basic Income Plus and basic income generally for many disabled people is it also helps them avoid severe poverty traps associated with disability, and it avoids some of the horrible features of the disability assessment system, the horrible sanctioning of disabled people, the enormous mental health costs that people pay because of the current system. So the current system is failing, and it fails disabled people particularly badly. A Basic Income Plus system avoids all of those problems. So there's a kind of targeting that isn't excluded by basic income, unless you're a basic income kind of minimalist. You won't accept any additional payments on top, which I just don't see the point of that. It doesn't make any sense. So that's one kind of targeting which is easily resolved. I mean, it raises some important issues, but it's not a really gobsmackingly difficult challenge to face. The other is that I think this, the poverty industry, if I might use that rather impolite term, but it talks about targeting and the attractions of a benefit system of targeting. But logically, what it really means is it needs higher means testing for poor people. That's all it means, because the only thing basic income does is say, actually, no, it's unacceptable to tax that basic income. Everybody should get it. So what basic income basically does in its design is say, to pay for the universality, you have to increase taxes at the top end. Maybe one of the political controversies here, and this is where, again, maybe I'm in a minority, I think like people who are on this call, like Paul, have done great work on how green taxes could maybe pay for a basic income for everybody. But in the UK, what's the harm of increasing income tax? We want to massively reduce inequality. I don't see really, it seems to me that basic income is fundamentally a way of redistributing income. And so making those with high incomes pay more tax to redistribute that to people on lower incomes seems to me to be straightforwardly moral and sensible and non-problematic. And it's even a gain for the rich. Their incomes might come down, but they still benefit from the security that a collective system provides, which is why, for instance, like the NHS is so efficient compared to a kind of American system that costs twice as much. So I think that, yeah, I think targeting is being done there. It's being done by targeting higher taxes on the rich, and it's being done by providing the extra income. What it's not doing is muddling these things up by targeting high marginal tax rates on the poor, I suppose. That's what basic income by design helps us solve that problem.
Okay, thanks, Simon. So turn to Kweku. So around targeting and around how it deals with inequalities in households across geographic regions.
Yeah, the reason why I'm against targeting is because it's demonstrably failed. All forms of poverty have gone up since the what was then a social security system changed into this, I don't know what you would call it, Department of Work and Pensions, universal credit, quagmire. And there's a very good reason for that, which is that you can never accurately target, because the people that you're targeting in an economy like ours will be shifting from different income groups at any given time. So for instance, one of the things we've been talking about over the last 5 years has been the gig economy and the notion of the precariat, which Guy Standing's done some great work on. And that group of citizens has moved in and out of various income strata. So it's one thing to say that you're going to be targeting a policy on the poorest, but if the poorest suddenly move into the middle income category and then back again into the poorest category quickly, you run into problems, because as everybody knows, there's a 5-week wait for universal credit. We know also that one of the problems that people have run into during the lockdown is that universal credit takes into account assets or savings that they might have. Now, that's obviously caused a lot of controversy, because people are beginning to understand that universal credit is targeted supposedly only for the poorest. And just to give a concrete example, one of the reasons why this targeting has failed is best demonstrated by the use and the existence of food banks, which continues to increase. In the last 5 years, it's gone up from nearly 900,000 at the time of the coalition government to 1.6 million. And the chief executive of the Trussell Trust has already said that food banks are no substitute for a proper welfare state and decent wages. So if targeting worked, we could all support it, because we could look at we could rely on things like universal credit, in times of crisis, or a decent welfare state that would remove the need for this kind of debate. But it's clearly failed, because the poorest are now using food banks because the welfare state isn't covering them, and also because, and people should look at the Trust statistics on this, because they're alarming. Many of the people using the food banks are in work, so supposedly not the poorest group of people, but yet still in a relationship of supplication to either the state or to charities. So we need to be looking at concrete income floors so that everybody is covered, depending on when, regardless of whether they are poor at one point, or medium income at another point, as a reflection of the fact that targeting has failed over this period and is costing us money, because all of this feeds into mental health, and most importantly, if you're a hard-headed man, into debt. We have a debt crisis in this country. The Office of, I'll just finish with this, the Office of Budget Responsibility, before Brexit and before the COVID lockdown measures, had said that debt, personal debt, which was at 150% of disposable income, would have to rise by 2020 to 180% of disposable income. This is the very thing that caused the financial crisis of 2008. We are encouraging people to go to lenders, often very dodgy lenders, to cover for the fact that the state wants to lower its spending. And that has already been demonstrated in the past to cause massive systemic shocks. So the necessity of an income floor is economically, morally, and if you look at the health angle to it, essential. So we should be looking at universality, rejecting targeted measures, simply on the basis of empirical evidence, economic empirical evidence, health empirical evidence, and societal empirical evidence.
Thanks, Kweku. And Cleo, can I ask you to?
Yeah, of course. I think Simon and Kweku have covered the evidence for why targeting has failed in the past and currently very in a lot of depth. So I'd talk more about the philosophical kind of aspect of this. And I think inequality is fundamentally an inequality of power. So like money, whether it's wealth, whether it's income, whatever it is, and you know, even just on a transactional basis between two human beings, you can be unequal if there is an imbalance of power. And I think that's what targeting reflects. The people who would be deciding on who gets the money, who gets stuff targeted at them, are the people who have the power. So for me, that doesn't do enough. Like, you know, having other people decide where they target benefits or resources of any kind isn't enough for me. So, and I think until we address that, until we change the way that we design these systems, we're always going to find that some people are left without, because it doesn't take into account everyone's needs in a meaningful way. And I think we can look at a basic income as an aspiration. We can look at the fundamental characteristics as something that you can't argue with. You can't say that if we build a basic income that's funded in a sustainable way and is enough to live off with dignity, that goes to everyone universally and without conditions, that wouldn't leave everyone in a better position than they currently are. I know there are some high-profile people that argue that a basic income is not a solution to poverty, and some basic incomes might not be a solution to poverty, but we can aspire towards a basic income that is a solution to poverty if we design it that way and we commit to that being what it does. It's just a question of making that political decision. Frankly, it is a political decision, and sticking to it until you meet that goal. And it might not be the first iteration of a basic income that does that. And for me, I'm not in the school of wanting a universal basic income, so a low-level payment that everyone receives as the first step to a basic income. I think the first step to a basic income is removing conditions from existing benefits and from existing social security. I think if you want to move towards a basic income, I think the fundamental and the most the core condition of a basic income is that it doesn't have conditions on it. And I think that's something that we could do very easily, is remove conditions. And that doesn't necessarily mean remove targeting. Like, you know, disability benefits still need to be targeted towards people with disabilities. But you can remove the conditions, the sanctions, the punitive elements of the current social security system quite simply now. And I think that would be a really meaningful, and rather than it being about money and it being about spending and it being about questioning whether we can or can't, it would be a real meaningful gesture towards a more equal society. I think I think trust is really inherent in an equal society, and I think if we actually care about having a more equal approach to things, you need to start building trust into our institutions, into our systems.
Clear. There are many questions. There are many questions to ask. I'm going to touch on one which is kind of coming up in the comments, and it's around, essentially, if we're talking about funding a basic income through a redistribution of wealth, through a change in taxation in some way, whilst we might not say what that might be, you know, it's a carbon tax, an income tax, whatever. There are going to be winners and losers. There are going to be people who are essentially contributing more, and there are going to be people who are benefiting more from it. So I call it one of net beneficiaries and net contributors. You know, people are contributing more to the scheme, and people are benefiting more from this scheme. Now, we know that the people who are contributing more, as said Cleo, are the people with power. They've got economic power, consumer power, political power. And they will perceive, therefore, basic income as an additional tax. We know that generally people who are economically comfortable won't see themselves as falling on hard times necessarily. They will currently see the benefit system as something that is separate from them. Most likely, certainly if you have savings and assets, you've got every confidence that you're not going to have to rely on anyone else but, say, a household. And certainly perhaps not foresee that you will fall on hard times. So you don't see basic income as relevant to yourself, and you see it as a cost. There's an additional cost. How do you persuade that section of society the economically comfortable that a basic income, a more equal society with basic income with redistribution is to their benefit. And actually return to Cleo.
It'll be a lot of conversations with a lot of people, and I think for different people it would be different arguments. Like, I've had plenty of conversations with people who were comfortable, who wouldn't, who don't see themselves as personally benefiting from a basic income, that think it's a great idea, and that might make quite significant changes to their life if they had a basic income of the right level. Because as much as our work is incredibly important, I love my work. Work is very tied to who I am and what I enjoy doing. But it's not just the stuff that I'm paid to do. There is plenty of work that I can't do because I don't have the economic means. And I think, more basically put, I don't get paid to do it, so I don't have time to do it. And I think there's plenty of people who are comfortable that would change, that would like to have that guarantee of income that's not tied to their work. But if they're not those kind of people, I think hopefully, and for many people, the argument that other people would benefit from it should be enough, and could be enough, that there are people who need it and therefore it's an expense worth investing in. But I do think, like during the crisis, many of us, well, all of us in fact, have experienced a dramatic change to our day-to-day lives, and the way that our work, our income is delivered to us. And I think for many people it's been a very negative experience. People, for self-employed people who previously were earning really good money went through a significant period of time where they had no idea where their next paycheck was coming from. And I think this has given us a taste of what it's like for many people all the time. So basically, I hope the answer is empathy. The answer, that's what would convince people, is helping them empathize with people who need something to change and that would be better off with a basic income.
Thanks, Claire. So, empathy. Turn to Simon.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that's really interesting about this is how messed up the current system is, and people don't really understand it. And so currently we spend about 200 odd billion pounds on benefits. And of that, I was just actually looking up the latest figure, but it's a really small amount. It's about 10% of that money actually gets redistributed to benefit actually about 30% of the population. Yeah, so what's happening is most of the money that you pay in tax, you get back in some kind of benefit, actually at all income levels, and only the poorest 30% benefit. The curious thing is, and this is the so-called targeted system. So the targeted system is really bad for the poor. They pay the highest percentage of their income in tax. They pay 50% of their income in tax. Because they pay so much of it through indirect taxes. So they pay more tax than anybody. They pay higher marginal taxes than any group, and they get bugger all. We're reaching a point where the poor are almost getting nothing out of the system at all. And the funny thing is the basic maths of basic income, if you just pay for basic income through income tax, then the swing point is the mean income. So everybody whose income is lower than the mean income will benefit, and everybody whose income is higher than the mean income will lose out if you think it's a loss. But for all the reasons Cleo described, it's not really a loss. But anyway, but you might think it is. If all you care about is the size of your bank balance or your paycheck, then you think of it as a loss, definitely. But that's about 15% of the population, because our economy is so unequal that the mean income is really very high. So actually, I suppose, Jason, one argument would be, well, sod them. What we really need to do is organise the 85% of us who will actually be better off. I'd be better off, and lots of other people would be better off with a basic income. The fact is, we don't know we'd be better off. Most people have never heard of the concept, certainly don't know what it would mean, and certainly don't know what the basic maths are. So I think one of the things the basic income movement, maybe the Equality Trust would be interested in joining in, is just explaining how this would work. Because actually most people would be better off. It's just a kind of basic design feature of basic income.
Thanks, Sam. So, okay, most people are better off. Empathy. Kweku, how do we grade?
Yeah, I mean, I can make the moral arguments all day. I mean, it should be an abomination that people are begging for food while, you know, some people have so much money they don't know what to do with. But I'm not, after the general election, certainly not interested in making those moral arguments. I think that there are people who can do that better. I'm becoming increasingly more interested in the pragmatic arguments. You know, we've just seen in the last week the Chancellor of the Exchequer going out trying to promote the economy, trying to get people to spend money. It's the whole basis of the Conservatives easing the lockdown measures, even when perhaps they shouldn't, because the economy needs to be stimulated. And if I was having a conversation with the richest 5% of this country, I'd be looking them straight in the eye and saying, this is good for you, and this is what you need, because what we need is people going to the shops and spending money. There's a reason why you cut, certainly there's the Labour approach, and even to some extent the Conservative approach after the war was to put more money either through tax cuts or through the welfare state or through full employment into the hands of the poorest. Why? Because they spend it, and they spend it locally. They go to local shops, they buy local produce, they buy local goods. They don't buy Ferraris or paintings from abroad or whatever the stereotypical things rich people are supposed to buy. They spend it in their local areas, they spend it in their local economy, which obviously multiplies up to the national, as a national economic multiplier. And everybody then, the richest, the poorest, and the middle class benefit from the increase in the GDP that causes the so-called multiplier effect. Put simply, a poor person with more money in their hands spends that in a local shop. That local shop then has more money with which to hire more people, with which to create more jobs, with which to create more tax revenue, which again boosts the GDP and boosts government reserves. So I'm looking at it from the pragmatic angle rather than the moral angle. For rich people and poor people, everybody is benefiting from this increase in participation in the economy, rather than us always relying on the richest to dole out money back into the economy, you know, either through charity or through creating more jobs. We want people at every layer of the economy participating in the economy, so that everybody can then take the fruits of that spending. And that's the way we need to be looking at it. We need to be looking at it in terms of the empirical evidence of what is necessary for the economy. We need proper social security so that we spend less dealing with the consequences of mental health, less dealing with the consequences of crime, less dealing with the social effects of, in the context of what's happened recently, a very racialized labour market and welfare state, which generally pits Black and ethnic minority people at the bottom of society through the discrimination inherent within those systems. If we're looking at a basic income for everybody, we're mitigating against all of these effects that harm poor people, middle class people, and rich people. So it's, and just to put a seal on it, one of the reasons why we should really be pushing this in a historical context is because the evidence has shown us for decades that if you put money into the hands of people right at the bottom, it stimulates the economy for everyone. The post-war boom came as a result of the fact that we were redistributing. We were redistributing through the welfare state. We were redistributing through full employment. We were redistributing through increases in pensions, and so on and so on and so on. You need to put more money back into the hands of people so they can spend it. And in terms of savings, you know, this is a country in which 17 million people have less than £100 in their bank account. So, this is not a question of avarice. This is a question of economic necessity, with genuine, tangible economic benefits as a result.
Okay. So, and yeah, interest on the chat in the practical impact of it, I suppose the financial impact of it. There are also questions around potential disincentives and impact on inflation, which I'm not sure we've got time to respond to here, but I know that there are responses certainly regarding the trials that have taken part, and much around models. I think I'll just, it's very difficult to ask one last question. I'm just going to ask one last question. Is in the spirit level, there's a chart done of the countries and the impact of having greater equality, and the fact that a more equal society just has benefits across just a huge range of indicators that in itself should benefit everyone, and everyone from kind of those who have virtually nothing to those who have far more than they know what to do with. In theory, it benefits all of society. So there's an argument. The countries that are sort of there, a block of countries that they're as often examples of a more equal society are the Nordic countries. And so we talk about the Nordic model and moving to a Nordic society, but the Nordic countries themselves have achieved this without a basic income. So what extra does a basic income give us that, if a country can move to greater equality without a basic income, can't we, we can do all these things and we can aim for all these things, but basic income surely isn't absolutely necessary for greater equality. It's kind of a nice to have, it's a potential, it's one model, but it's not an absolute thing that we really need. And if I could return to you, Kweku, on that.
Yeah, there's a very simple answer to that. The Nordic countries are starting from a much higher base, social base than we are. I explained what happened to North Sea oil, which is a direct comparison between Britain and Norway. Both countries had oil, lots of it. One country decided to nationalize its oil and put the wealth from that nationalization into a sovereign wealth fund. It became one of, or at least at one point, the richest country in the world in terms of GDP per head. Another country, Britain, decided to take that oil money, privatize the wealth from it, and give it back in the form of tax cuts for the rich. And we see the fruits of the unequal society that is created. Secondly, the Nordic countries, particularly Norway, Sweden is slightly different because they've started to move to a more, I hate using the word, but for the sake of argument, more neoliberal model. Norway and Sweden have very, very strong trade unions and very, very high, by comparison to us, levels of government ownership. So in terms of national wealth, the Norwegian government owns about 7 out of 10, or sorry, 70% rather, easier, 70% of its national wealth. So in terms of where the wealth is held and its ability to redistribute, it's much more effective. I mean, ours is very, very low. I think it's less than 20%. And then thirdly, and this is the reason why I think if we haven't already done so, we should reiterate it further, that this is an ancillary demand. Basic income, in the same way that the National Health Service is not going to deal with unequal bargaining power between labour and capital, basic income is no substitute for a very, very radical approach to housing, more money going into the NHS, stronger trade unions, collective bargaining. All of these things have to happen in step with basic income. And I think this is the constant mistake that is made in this debate. This is one demand as a part of a package of demands, not a silver bullet that solves everything. What we're trying to do is we're trying to create a stronger base from which all of these other demands can be accelerated. Practical example, in terms of trade unions, having a basic income gives you the greater ability to bargain with your employer, because the whole principle of bargaining between labour and capital rests on the fact that the employer can tell has control over the employee in terms of the employee's basic dignity. Because without a job, you have no money, and without any money, you can't afford the basics with which to survive with dignity. However, if you have, and that's why the Nordic countries are stronger, if you have a stronger element of basic dignity, that gives you longer to resist. You can almost see it as a sort of ancillary strike fund, because you have a longer threshold with which to resist the unequal bargaining power that capital enforces on you through saying that if you misbehave, we're going to take your job from you. And that's what we're trying to do, build that floor which allows all the other demands, of which there are many, to gain in strength, rather than a one-size-fits-all solution to everything, because that simply can't exist.
Cleo?
I think for me, it's the context is different. The political context is different. I think that's the main point. We don't have a solution to equality. We have an unequal society because the political choices that have been made have led us there. So I think we need something like a basic income to be the kind of uniting policy, to be something to work towards, to be something that we can all see that we would benefit from. Like, as much as we think it's going to be difficult to convince the people that we need to convince about basic income, I think it's far easier to rally behind a sort of sexy, exciting, fundamental, radical policy like a basic income that initiates these fascinating conversations. And as much as people might disagree with me, I've never failed to have a conversation with anyone about basic income. And I think that is often, opening that door, like having that conversation is the problem. Like, we don't address these issues in real terms. Like, people, the empty platitudes that we hear around inequality and poverty aren't going to solve those problems. And I think something like even talking about basic income, talking about, well, why can't we just give everyone enough money so they don't live in poverty, so they don't have to suffer at the hands of decisions other people are making on their behalf. I think that is why a basic income works for the UK better than other options from around the world, because I think we need that. We need this question posed, and we need this this shift in narrative and shift in political approach. But just on a personal level, like, we have a very individualistic approach to politics, and we blame people for being poor. And I think a basic income, and even the conversations around it, but also the kind of excitement, because we would all benefit from a basic income, we're all automatically having to think about how other people would benefit about it, from it. So for me, that's why I think a basic income is the policy for the UK, because I think we need something that is a little bit, and maybe pitched a bit lower, pitched a bit lower than the Nordic countries. And I do think the other side of it is also, there's like questions about immigration, like and whether there's been quite closed systems and in those countries that have allowed them to negotiate politically over the course of whatever. But yeah, I think the fact that we're not in the same position as them just now, and that we're not making those decisions, is enough for the solutions to not be the ones that they have, because they haven't been so far. So we need to find another one.
Thanks, Cleo. And Simon?
Yeah, well, Citizen Network, which I'm chair of, has members in Norway, Sweden and Finland, Jason, and they're all very keen on basic income. And there was a pilot in Finland, because many of the problems in the modern economy are throwing up that the old system isn't working. And so I think I'd challenge your premise. Yes, you can have, because there are three ways of improving equality: taxing the rich, distributing incomes better within organisations, and thirdly, raising the income of the poor. You can do a lot of the second one, which the Finns and other Scandinavians have done. You can accept a higher level of tax and still not have done that much to the third. But as they're starting to grapple with this issue now in Scandinavian countries, and pulling both ways, so there are kind of right-wing groups also wanting more conditionality, and I think somebody mentioned in Denmark and in the Netherlands, for instance, there are pressure. This is a highly political issue, and it's a political issue globally, and there isn't any kind of real secret zone of places that have solved equality and places that are not responding at all. It's a political issue, and it's going to continue to be a political issue. The question for advocates of equality is, do you care about the floor? Does that matter in your calculations about how we're going to move to a more equal society? If you care about the floor, then you've got to either support basic income or some alternative for raising the floor. And the great attraction of basic income is that it's universal, so we've all got a stake in it, and it doesn't penalise. You can call it targeting if you like, but it doesn't penalise the poor by creating extra means testing for the poor. That's why it's such a great policy for all of us, but particularly for people on low incomes. And that's why the Equality Trust should get behind it.
Thanks very much, Simon. I would just like to thank so much for making such an interesting discussion, Cleo, Kweku, and Simon. I'm just going to turn to each of our speakers and just ask one action that the people watching this can just do tonight, next week. Simon first.
Yes, get in touch with the UBI Lab Network and volunteer to create a UBI Lab in your community. You knew I was going to say that.
Did. Thanks, Simon. And Kweku, one thing?
Yeah, following Simon, get in touch with the UBI Lab Network and read up on various basic income groups. We've got Basic Income UK. We're doing a lot of very useful work on this. And yeah, just try and educate yourself about this policy and consider it when you go to the ballot box whenever we have our next election.
Thanks, Kweku. And Cleo?
Mine's have a conversation with someone about basic income. Think about someone that you're not sure what their stance on it would be, and start with the question, what would you do if you had a basic income? I always find that's a fascinating conversation to have with someone, whether you know them well or not, to ask them what they would do if they had that option. And if you want any support doing that, you can drop us an email at basicincome.conversation.org. We can help, but you've got to have a conversation with someone, an interesting one.
I found this a very, very interesting conversation, and thank you very much again to our speakers. Thanks very much to everyone for attending, for answering our questions. I am sorry we have obviously not managed to cover many of them. Please do head over to the hashtag UBI, our Twitter, if you want to carry on conversations. Doubtless this conversation will indeed carry on. It's been very pleasurable to be part of it. So thanks very much.